I'm sorry about that.
And we're live. Welcome everybody to a virtually connecting hangout. We are coming to you from DLRN 15 or DLearn. With us today is a panel, an excellent panel, and we're looking forward to having a discussion with them. We're going to go through quickly and introduce ourselves, starting with the on-site buddies, and then online, Gregory, Kelsey, Jack, Christian, and Maha.
Hi, I'm Patrice Fresco, and it's great to be here and see everybody. And I'm the on-site buddy for this session.
Hi, I'm Jim Groom. I work at Reclaim Hosting, and it's great to be here. Thanks.
My name is Adam Croom. I'm the Director of Digital Learning in the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Oklahoma.
I'm GZ. I teach educational technology at Western Oregon University, 2 hours south of Portland.
Kelsey?
Oops, I forgot it was my turn. My name is Kelsey Schmitz. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa in Ontario, Canada, and I'm an anti-oppressive technology educator.
Anti-oppressive technology, like it. Jack?
Oh, hi. This is Jack Norton, faculty in history and the Center for Teaching and Learning campus leader here at Normandale Community College in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Christian?
Hi, this is Christian from Hamburg, Germany. I will work at Leuphana University, close to Hamburg and Lüneburg, and specifically at Leuphana Digital School, we design online courses around the hypothesis of problem-based learning, social learning, and so on.
Okay, and I am Mahabeli from Cairo, Egypt. I also am a faculty developer. I work at Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo, which I almost never say in Hangouts. And it's very interesting that almost all of us are faculty developers, Center for Learning and Teaching people, except Jack, I guess, or maybe not. But we have with us Adam and Jim, who are presenting at the conference, right? Yes. Together.
Together, hand in hand.
As one.
As one. Yeah,
Can you tell us what you guys are going to be presenting? I can't hear you guys very well. Could you come a little bit closer to whatever the device is, or bring the device closer to you? And maybe just...
Is that okay?
Yes, that's great. Can you hear us clearly?
Yes.
Great. So talking a little bit about our presentation today, we're actually going to try and compare the music industry and the changes in the music industry, as well as a specific element of that music industry, 1980s punk, to empowering individuals with their own web spaces. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I totally agree. I hope it makes sense because we're up like an hour. So, yeah, and I think what we're talking about is how are those movements portrayed, and what are the stories that end up getting told, and what are potential alternative narratives that are actually happening there, and how can we support alternative narratives as well.
It's interesting too because Adam focuses really on the technical revolution at work with music in the industry from the 60s up until now. And I focus on a moment in the 80s when technology wasn't really the issue. Whether the issue was a kind of social, political reaction to the mainstream relationships in music, the production of music, how you were kind of told you could create music, who distributed that music, apart from the digital. And so we're trying to look about how when we think about this stuff, we're not only talking about a used part of technology, which it is, but also this, really important elements of the culture around it. And how the culture around it, whether we want to think about it or not, like an alternative ed tech culture, is not necessarily just trying to be angry and mean and, you suck, Blackboard. Actually, they're serving an unbelievable kind of resource to the pushing forward of the field. Because the mainstream will settle for what people like and they'll get codified, it's the alternative that actually is going to define the culture in the next decade or two. And I think that's part of the argument we're trying to make with thinking about why alternative education, or indie ed tech as we're calling it, is extremely important, not so much as a scream, but as a way to think about these are the spaces we'll experiment with and build upon that I think in another decade or so we'll see that have kind of taken on the narrative and have become the mainstream, right? That kind of cycle. So giving that space in universities like Adam has done in Oklahoma is extremely important, even practically.
Yeah, and I think what's fun about looking at this historically, and I think why Jim and I grasp onto this idea of music is so cultural, and there's this history of music and technology and universities coming together at the early days of the computer, at the early days of the internet. That's really interesting to kind of examine and think about how what happened there can be extrapolated to now, and how we can think about that same kind of cultural movement and understanding EdTech as a cultural and philosophical choice that we tend to make.
Yeah, I agree. And the other cool thing too is it has the independent music scene in the 80s has some interesting kind of moments of like the independent record label. Like Discord Records in Washington, D.C., run by folks from Minor Threat, decided we're going to go completely outside mainstream record distribution and build our own. And as a result, they built a culture, and a culture that was premised on an ethos, and an ethos that was in constant discourse with the predominant culture. And that culture often brought in questions of race, questions of gender. You'll think about the Riot Girls and the Bikini Kill that comes in the late 80s, early 90s. That's a whole stream of musical kind of reality that now we take to some degree for granted, had to be struggled for. And so I think thinking about EdTech in some of those terms, hopefully with the analogy we create, works. And if it doesn't, it's his fault.
Do people virtually have questions?
Yeah, I think GC's been saying some stuff, so I'll let him ask.
I could ask a number of questions. I'm glad to see 80s punk being brought back. So, of course, that frames the first question. Are you doing Clash and or mainstream corporate punk rock and the Pistols with the glory hounds of publicity and media spectacle? Or are you moving closer to, it sounds like you're working with Discord, but is it like Discord and Bad Brains, or are you moving into like maximum rock and roll, small label, full-on indie punk? The reason why I'm asking is that each of, just like punk rock, fragmented and has all of those very different scenes and very different cultures, EdTech is exploding in all these different directions as well.
Yeah, I would say that's the point as much as anything else.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is absolutely. Sorry, I don't want to cut.
So what I'm wondering is, one, what bands or labels are you using as your metaphors or analogies? And the other thing that I was wondering is, how do you see the current rebellion, if there is anyone, actually present in EdTech? Because it seems to be more that corporate solutions are generated, and then people seem to respond to, oh, how can I use these tools? Whereas a lot of at least the early political punk was, we're angry, we're very upset, we're young, we like music, this is loud, we'll use whatever 3 chords we can get. And anyhow.
No, I think those are a great series of questions and technical into the whole punk question, because it's funny, as soon as you bring in something and someone knows something, it opens up a whole other series of questions. To be specific in answering, I'm using this book, Our Band Could Be Your Life, by Michael Azerrad, who wrote about basically the U.S. independent music scene from 1980 to 1990, beginning with Black Flag and ending with Beat Happening. That's kind of his decade. And I think the argument he makes that Adam pointed to is that punk wasn't a thing. Like, it was this completely differentiated relationship to power and to the relationship of how you understood yourself in relationship to the mainstream, in relation to, questions of, like you said, whether it be angry with like the Henry Rollins Black Flag, or more kind of like this twee rethinking gender that you have with Calvin Johnson and Beat Happening. So like, you have a very different kind of relationship. It's particularly U.S., so it is centric in that way. but it's about a broader vision of punk, not as having tight hair and being kind of true to the death maximum rock and roll, but having a kind of relationship outside of the predetermined system that produces culture. And using that position as a way to kind of create tension that hopefully brings on whole new ways of thinking about art. And the keynote was really good in that. Like, the keynote basically asked us to challenge whether we really think the web as it is works. And I think that's punk rock, right? Like, that's punk rock and tech. Like, the HTML is broken, and like, we need to think about small spread, whether you agree with it or not, right? Just like if you agree with the violence and the screaming and the 3 chords. I think it became a lot more evolved and complex as a movement.
Whoops. Sorry, small mistake here. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah. So I think that's part of those cultural elements you bring in, and I think we're trying to, I don't think I'll make the case, but why are the butthole surfers bunk, right? Why? I'm not going to maybe argue that, but like, the idea is punk is a relational reality. And I think right now, questions of social justice and challenging some of those are pretty punk, or you could call them something else. You can call them hip. I mean, you could find your analogy. This is the analogy I think Adam and I are using to try and understand what independent ed tech might look like based on some historical models for music.
Yeah, and particularly how can it, or how is it, or is it not being supported? I think that's what we're trying to think about is administrations and faculty make these decisions. How the argument isn't that indie ed tech is new or that it's revolutionary. The argument is it's been happening for a long time. These decisions are being made at a classroom level, and are there ways in which they can be supported? Is that possible?
Yeah.
And what are models in which we can look at to think about that?
It's great too because it brings us into 90s alternative indie rock, right? Which you have a lot of these indie rock bands that get signed. And, they do try and manage that difference. One example is Built to Spill. Built to Spill was on a major record label, but yet still kept independent and had their kind of vision of that. And so what the 80s bands had started, the 90s bands had to kind of deal with that whole indie scene. And I think part of what we're dealing with around, these radical social media, Web 2.0 ed tech are not radical or old anymore, right? They're pretty much mainstream. But, us at Reclaim Hosting, we're doing this radical thing of offering people 2003 technology. Web hosting! You are amazing! And if we could put that, slick, look at this, databases, WordPress. That's been around. And it's taken us as communities a full decade. Or even 12 years to get our heads around that. And I think there's a little bit of this kind of, the trailing edge technology is interesting for a lot of ways because it does bring us back to the web that Mike Caulfield thinks is broken. But at the same time, it brings up questions of literacy and fluency for students and for communities that we're just not doing at our campuses. I mean, show us examples where students can actually interrogate the web in any real way as part of a system set up by a university. And I think you'll find a couple of examples at best at the thousands of universities across the country and the world. So, I mean, it's also a social service, as we're seeing.
How are we doing on time? 11:17.
How are we doing on time? Are you guys done hearing us? Are you finished with us?
There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions for you. So, for as long as you guys can stay, we're staying. So, Kelsey, did you want to go next, and then Jack?
Sure. So my question kind of centers around the idea of, well, first I'd like to say the kind of digital literacy that you're talking about lacking with our students is something I see lacking with the majority of my colleagues as well as students. My concern with the idea of bringing in cultural items, I'm not necessarily just focusing on the punk aspect, but a cultural item would be that those cultural items or cultural spaces already have their own kind of issues in the problematic sense. And for me, I focus on the gaming culture, youth studies and gaming, and we see this constant push for having gamification and gaming-style classrooms, and yet we never trouble the cultural issues that are happening with that culture already and what that impact could have on our classroom. So kind of I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say this. I think that a lot of times we decide not to make specific technology choices because there are issues that we don't want to see raised. And when I look at what you're speaking of and this idea of gaming culture, we get a lot of questions at our institution like, well, how do we think about digital literacy with these tools, and what should we be teaching, and what does this require us to do now? And I think the argument that I would make is why weren't we crossing that bridge before we made these technology decisions? And what I think I've seen is that there have been technology decisions that we fail to make because we might sometimes be a little over concerned with consequences. And I don't think that necessarily is against what you're saying at all. I think it actually those are congruent thoughts. But I think sometimes we want to put those technologies into classrooms to seed friction to some degree. So it is something that we can bump up against as a society and culture.
And I just want to jump in for a second. The next session has started, so do you want to wrap this up so that you can see the panel, or do you want to keep going?
Go for a little bit longer.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think to your point, Kelsey, about the cultures, which is a good one, and Gamergate really hit hard, right? I mean, and the question I think there is, where is this space in our notion of space online a space of asserting your voice? At what point do you pull back? At what point do you decide? And I think one of the things that's unique to me, and the rhetoric it may vary, but the idea is we have systems now, hopefully, where students can speak or assert that voice or decide not to, and be able to differentiate in that space and define it as part of who they are in those conversations over time, whether they're private or public. And that notion that you do kind of shape a space and a presence, or it will be shaped for you, is important. Now, I don't think by defaulting to this we say, all conversations about all technology always happen online in the open and anyone can be compromised at any time. I think Martha Burtis, who I worked with at Mary Washington, always said this, and I agree. Part of the domain of one's own is the ability to say, I don't want a domain of my own. Like, that's actually part of it. It's not like this is your solution, thank you, wrapped up, go. But part of it is thinking, like, this is a critically problematic space for me for these reasons. And that's absolutely as important as saying this has changed my relationship to my identity online. So I don't think there's any one kind of, hopefully, dominant monolithic narrative that's suggesting that this is the way. And that's where all analogies, particularly music analogies, break down, because a lot of these bands early on in the 80s weren't very forward-thinking when it came to questions of race and gender, and that kind of broke free a little bit in the 90s and the late 80s. But there's all sorts of problems with the analogy, and it would break down if you push it hard enough. So I don't want to pretend that there's any kind of perfect idea on our part that this is going to speak to all problems across ed tech.
So I'm curious, I don't know punk worth diddly, but I play a little guitar, and so I'm kind of familiar when you talked about, oh yeah, they had 3 chords. Yeah, I get that, because you can just do 3 chords, but one of the nice things about that is that you only need 3 chords. Like, literally, you could just bang away. My 5-year-old can do it. But here's the challenge. Oftentimes when I come to my students, like, all right, we're gonna do something DH. It's not 3 chords. Like, they're developing tools, and it's not as hard as oftentimes we imagine it or they imagine it, but it's not empowering in the sense of, like, it's so simple, anybody can do it. It actually, I mean, that's the message that I try and convey. That's what we're trying to impress them with. But it strikes me that there's this odd disconnect, that we're trying to ask them to scale up their skills, whereas with music it seems like they're actually, like, the musicianship was actually, they were trying to intentionally scale back. And I see that, and the reason that I'm wondering about this is that because there's this potential for the empowerment in terms of you're fighting against a disempowering organization or disempowering institution, or disempowering, like within music, you're saying, no, you don't have to be Beethoven, you can have a message, and you don't have to be able to write Beethoven. with our students, in some ways, we're saying use these big skills or use these new skills, and it seems like it's slightly at odds. So one, you're scaling down, you're fighting the, let's just shorthand and say you're fighting the man by using fewer skills, chords, whatever, whereas with DH, oftentimes we're fighting the man by trying to engage with kind of the radically democratic nature of digital production by actually scaling up. And I'm just wondering, like, is there a disconnect there? How do you see that?
So, yeah, so I have a musician background too, and I would say one of the things that I think gets lost is that a huge factor in how someone grows as a musician is time, you know, and that ability to sit in a space for more than what I would argue to be the normal length of, you know, a college assignment sometimes. And I think that's a big struggle that we see within these types of projects as well, is that something that can really help propel someone is sitting within this space and for longer than a project, you know, and actually having some kind of continuity between it. The music example would be that we were all in high school bands that were terrible at one point. You know, like that's just where everyone stopped, and we all lost the battle of the band and were crushed about our music abilities. Like you go through that as a musician, but it is part of a growing stage. And what we have to think about is how do we have these linked opportunities as well. When I see these work, it's when things that are a little bit more long term, and I really think that time is a factor that is, you know, that when ed tech, when we hear a narrative of better, faster, stronger, it's missing the fact that part of what we're trying to do is get students to sit in something for a little bit long term. And I don't know if that addresses the question.
I think it's beautifully, and I think that's one of the things that you talk about there, that the bands in the 80s and 90s, because they did start out three-chord wonders and they were angry and maybe they didn't have the sophistication, but as they started to evolve as musicians, you know, they were being pulled by their fans to just play the old songs that were these angry, aggressive, rather than these more complex. But I think that's part of, you're going to find any evolution of a student, and once they're starting that evolution, well, then they're a student on the process to critically examine this infrastructure, and I think you're in a good situation. So I agree with you entirely, and it's funny that that also maps on top of our analogy of a lot of bands like hated the whole short hair with the Henry Rollins punk, so they grew it long intentionally to fight it. Or like, you know, Minutemen, they became, you know, they started doing kind of unplugged before you would do unplugged. Like in the 90s, they all acoustic, and it was very soulful, and it was not what you would consider traditionally punk. And I think it's that experimentation which happens within the classroom and hopefully within the technology and the relationship to it that you would capture the spirit of, maybe rather than saying, make it simple, make it ugly, but keep it that way. But sometimes making it simple and ugly allows people to feel that low stake that they can jump in and then fire the passion. So it's tricky. You know, there's no one answer. Like I said, if we push on the punk analogy long enough, it will fall. I've been through this before, and it will fall hard. So I don't pretend like this is a bulletproof example of anything.
So to wrap up, there are a couple of sort of questions or comments that came to mind as I was listening to you describe punk. Just like Jack, punk doesn't really say a lot to me. My background in music is a little different. One of the big things that came to mind is this whole notion of shadow IT. So if IT proper does not support this type of pedagogical experimentation with technology, it kind of falls upon shadow IT, which sometimes it's frowned upon. And then the other part there was empowering faculty to feel that, to not be afraid, let's say, of the FERPA monster when they're dealing with things like this, because I think there is a great deal of fear and uncertainty when they're going out, when they're painting outside the lines that, let's say, the IT or the Learning Commons group have provided for them. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Go ahead.
I love the shadow IT idea. I think that really models beautifully what a lot of these bands and where punk in some ways as an ethos, maybe then as a musical genre anyone would like, a lot of these people built their own network. And like you guys are doing with Virtually Connecting, right? They built an independent network of people all over the continent and then in Europe where they could share freely outside of the predefined channels that were defining what a genre in a musical, and that's punk rock, right? Like virtually connecting is potentially punk rock, right? Like you're actually creating a distributed network of people who are coming together, not through any institutional affiliation, to share ideas and to build a network that then, when the next thing happens, they'll give back. And you see this happen all the time in our networks, and it's awesome. And I think what Adam has done, and done brilliantly, is he started to build that kind of space in a university where that's actually provided the tools for people to do it easily and to actually get help and support. And that changes the discussion a bit. It's part of that evolution. And so shadow IT now doesn't actually have to be so shadowy because its value has been established and people are adopting it. And we're starting to see that that's a good thing. Like that also is what we're here as ed tech or as faculty developers to do, is to help our institutions make a longer, broader step to the future. And that means giving faculty and students more power over their data and over their persona. And it also, and that's one way to do it, is the way you're doing it with Create OU. Like, there's a lot of different ways to think of the disappearance of shadow IT, at least for the moment, might be a good thing, right? I don't think it's only about, like, stick a fork in everything that's power and say it's done, but to understand how those relations work and that how sometimes outside of those institutions we could do far more good than inside.
Yeah, and I would say on the supporting faculty side, a lot of my my day-to-day friction is this idea of essentially putting on my administrator cap. I'm a major label, in some degree, and to some degree that means wanting a level of control. But what I'm trying to help people understand is that the building of these networks and finding administrations that are willing to support it, even if it is at an arm's distance, is how faculty get supported. Is if it's not at the administration level, it's going to be within their network, however that exists. From anywhere from a face-to-face to digital type environment. But what we have to do is nurture these little pockets of cultures that exist. I think that's the best way that we move forward, thinking about education, thinking about technology, and the future of what we want to do. And the good news is that's rooted in what's happened historically. That's like we look at the stories, like the classic MIT hackers stories. It's just nurturing environments in which students have opportunities to do this, and people feel comfortable within those spaces themselves.
And I think that's perfectly said. And I think it also, like, punk rock needed mainstream media to be, right? Independent ed tech needs the LMS in some ways to be, right? Like, it wouldn't be one or the other, right? Like, we need things to react to and to understand what are the limits of our system as it stands in order for us to kind of, route around that and build something else. And also, as a culture, we're building with the humanness of the whole network. And that's part of what we're trying to understand now is, what's the humanity of it all? Like, we're pretty comfortable now doing these virtual distributed discussions, and they're pretty radical, and I don't even think of it as crazy anymore. Or even putting credit card information out there and buying shit, like we do it all the time. But, like, how does that change our relationships to the notion of humanity and connecting and networking outside of institutions that we have taken for granted for 15, 20 years, and that our faculty and students to some degree still do? And so in some ways, we're all out there on this kind of plane doing this stuff, assuming it, but it's our job to translate that back into, whether it be a bad analogy like punk or whatever, to try and make sense of how these things are changing and what it means for our culture and why the things that are maybe happening in a hangout like this are the future of what we're going to see in about 5 or 10 years. And I think that's an interesting space where the independence of an ed tech movement can be really valuable and should be cherished by institutions. I really think that they should be paying attention, and they usually don't. And that's the kind of also alternative narrative to these independent scenes. They often die, or are completely bought up and
we've almost talked longer than the entire punk scene existed. So we'll stop.
Yeah, sorry. We have no problem speaking.
We have no problem listening and bringing forth additional questions. But I think that just to keep things moving, we should wrap up. Thank you, everybody, both the on-site buddies, the on-site presenters, everybody who joined us virtually, for coming in, sharing your questions, sharing your views. And just as a reminder, we have 2 more sessions today, current sessions during lunch, so you have options, and everybody loves options, and 1 this evening right before the plenary. So we're looking forward to seeing you for additional virtual connecting sessions today. With that, we're signing off. Thank you all for joining, and see you again soon.
Thank you guys so
Great.
much for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.